I'd like to begin by saying that I'm a very practical person. I've never been one to buy into ghost stories or urban legends, but what happened to me last New Year's Eve forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about reality. Living in a small town, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, means I'm no stranger to quiet nights and dark, winding roads. That's part of the charm, really, or so I thought. A good friend of mine, Mark, was throwing his annual New Year's Eve party at his family's cabin, which was deep in the woods and only accessible by a narrow, tree-lined road. The cabin was known for its spectacular views and remote charm. It was a place where people went to escape. But that night, it became a place I desperately wanted to leave. I started my drive around 7 p.m. The road to Mark's cabin was pitch black, and the headlights from my car barely cut through the dense fog rolling off the hills. It was cold, colder than usual for this time of year, and the air had that stillness that made everything feel a little too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just settle over a place, it suffocates it. About halfway there, as I navigated a particularly sharp curve, my headlights illuminated something on the side of the road, a figure. At first I thought it was a deer, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing completely still, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress that billowed slightly in the icy wind. Her face was turned away from the road, her gaze lost in the woods. Instinctively, I slowed down. Who could possibly be out here at night, dressed like that? The dress wasn't just impractical, it looked ancient, like something out of a period drama. I considered stopping to ask if she needed help, but as my car crept closer, something about her posture and the unnatural stillness in her movement set off alarm bells in my mind. I drove past her, my heart pounding. In my rearview mirror, I saw her turn to face the car. She didn't wave, didn't move toward the road. She just stared, her face pale and gaunt, almost luminous in the darkness. Her eyes, they didn't reflect the light the way a person should. It was like looking into two black voids. By the time I reached Mark's cabin, the encounter was already starting to feel like a bizarre trick of the light, something I could rationalize away. The party was in full swing, the cabin glowing with warm light and laughter. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. It felt silly, like something out of a ghost story. The night wore on, and as midnight approached, the mood grew celebratory. We counted down the seconds, toasted to the new year, and slowly, people began to leave. I stayed back to help clean up, not eager to face the dark road again. Around 1 a.m., I finally got in my car to head home. The air was colder now, and frost glittered on the cabin's windows. As I drove down the winding road, I kept my eyes on the asphalt, determined not to let my imagination run wild. But then I noticed something strange. My car felt heavier, like the engine was working harder than it should. I glanced in my rearview mirror and froze. There, in the back seat, was the woman. Her face was pale and expressionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was staring at me through the mirror, her eyes dark and unblinking. My breath caught in my throat as panic surged through me. I swerved the car to a stop on the side of the road, heart pounding in my ears. Whipping around, I looked at the back seat, but it was empty. No sign of her. Just the dim light from the dome lamp and the crumpled jacket I'd tossed there earlier. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was exhaustion or a trick of the shadows, but as I turned back to the road and started driving again, a whisper broke through the silence. "Can you see me now?" The voice was soft, almost melodic, and it sent shivers down my spine. I slammed on the brakes, fumbling for my phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no service. The whisper came again, this time from right beside me. "Don't leave me here." I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I might see. The passenger seat was empty, but on the window, written in the fogged glass, were the words, "Stay." The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't remember much except the feeling of being watched, of not being alone in that car. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I bolted inside and locked every door and window. I spent the night on the couch, every creak and groan of the house setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, I went to inspect my car. The back seat was empty, of course, but on the outside of the rear window there was a single handprint, larger than any human hand I'd ever seen. It was New Year's Eve, and like every year I was heading to a friend's house for the night. My best friend Jared lived in a small neighborhood surrounded by forest. The only way to get there was a narrow country road that wound through the woods. I'd driven the route countless times before, but something about that night felt different. The weather had taken a sudden turn, and a light snow began to fall as I left my house. The road was slippery, the snow reflecting my headlights, making visibility worse. As I neared the halfway point, I passed the same old shack I always saw, a decrepit, leaning structure that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Except this time, there was a light on inside. The shack had always been dark, boarded up and abandoned. Seeing a faint orange glow flickering from the window gave me pause. It could have been a candle, or maybe someone's flashlight, but why would anyone be there? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I decided not to dwell on it and kept driving. By the time I arrived at Jared's, the shack was already out of my mind. The party was in full swing, and everyone was in a celebratory mood. We rang in the new year with music, laughter, and drinks. It was close to 2 a.m. when I decided to head home. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped further, leaving a thick frost on everything. As I drove back down the dark road, I felt an unease I couldn't explain. When I approached the shack, I slowed down instinctively. The light was still on, but now the front door was wide open. I drove past as quickly as I could, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I was almost home when I noticed the strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft tapping noise. I thought it was something in my car, until I realized it was coming from the back seat. My heart raced as I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment I saw nothing. Then, in the dim light, I caught the outline of a figure. Slamming on the brakes, I turned around in my seat, but the back was empty. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was I just exhausted? I decided not to stop again until I reached home. When I pulled into my driveway, I bolted out of the car and rushed inside. I locked the doors and went straight to bed, desperate to forget the night. But just as I was about to drift off, there was a loud knock at my front door. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the window, peeking out cautiously. There, standing on my porch, was a man. His clothes were ragged, his face hidden in shadow. In his hand, he held a rusty lantern that cast an eerie glow. When he turned toward the window, his eyes seemed to lock onto mine, even through the glass. I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding. The knocking stopped, but the man didn't leave. He stood there, motionless, for what felt like hours. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, he was gone. In his place, sitting on the porch, was the lantern, still flickering with that unnatural orange light. The next day, I drove back down that road, but the shack was gone. Not boarded up or abandoned, gone, as if it had never existed.